Good afternoon, everyone. I know I don't have to say this, but continue eating. Deb, you have been a great role model and friend, and I thank you. Jeff, you are a new friend, and I have, the jury's still out as to whether, thank you. No, I really appreciate the opportunity to come to Fairlawn. I was a little nostalgic coming in. My aunt for many years, and she's going through a very painful transition for those of you with family members or friends that have have been diagnosed with some form of dementia. You know that that is a very much a robber of the people that you love. You know, you lose them twice, as a friend of mine says. So I came on the plane and sorry to get, it was bittersweet, landing in Cleveland's airport. But to me, it underscores how vital the conversations that we're having over these 3 days, are, and how technology can be help those like my Aunt May, and help the caregivers of those of my Aunt May. Really, honestly, forgive me for being informal, keep it together. So connectivity has the power to revolutionize people's day-to-day lives. And it has already transformed the entire spectrum of industry by boosting productivity, improving manufacturing techniques, and reducing downtimes for enterprises large and small. Next generation systems, the Internet of Things, and big data analytics can cut costs and generate new revenue while dramatically improving our lives. With such radical transformations already underway, it is vital that regulatory policies, most notably our Federal Universal Service Framework, stay ahead of the curve to meet the needs of tomorrow. That is why I begin today's conversation, like so many other conversations I have, with a clear yet simple statement. Our communication system is special. I make this declaration for two reasons. First, because I fear we take that too much for granted. And second, because it is critical that we never take that fact for granted. Why? Because what this system carries is often intensely personal and sometimes difficult to quantify. In an instant, these networks put our voice in someone's ears, our face before someone's eyes, transmit our thoughts or ideas to one person or many. They bring us to school, to the doctor, to the bank, deliver goods, provide services, usher help in case of an emergency, connect us to news, enable our leisure, and immediately give us a presence in just about any community in the world. For better or worse, these communication services seem less like a tool and more like an extension of ourselves. But the communications sector does not just intersect with every other critical sector of our economy, society, and democracy. It is inextricably linked. Be it healthcare, education, energy, agriculture, commerce, governance, civic engagement, labor, housing, transportation, public safety, they all rely on this modern communications infrastructure. If there are any weaknesses or shortcomings, systemic or isolated, we will witness ripple effects that may at first be difficult to discern, but are unmistakable in impact. While it is important to ensure sound communications policy at every level, we all should view these efforts as a means to a greater end. Because when it comes to these networks, the greatest benefits accrue when we embrace those core principles that ultimately define who we are and what the responsibility at the Federal Communications Commission is. As mandated by Congress and clearly stated in the Communications Act, The FCC must do everything in its power to ensure that robust, ubiquitous, open, and affordable advanced telecommunications services and networks blanket this country, because without these critical networks, none of the innovation and growth we ever hope to achieve in any of these sectors is possible. That is why promoting the deployment and adoption, emphasis on and, of broadband-enabled services is a top priority. And this is why we must remain vested in our next generation communications networks being strong, reliable, and accessible. The benefits of broadband-enabled technologies are vast, but the challenges are many. Those unable to fully adopt, more often the economically challenged, and those in rural communities, they're being left behind. And if we fail to properly address this persistent, chronic divide, the already disadvantaged may never, ever catch up. But with the right mix of community engagement, smart, targeted government policies, notably properly leveraged spectrum and competition policies, public-public, private-public, and private-private partnerships, those currently on the wrong side of the digital and opportunities divide can be positioned for boundless success. And while important for many business models, and those of you represented in this room, this also means, don't beat me up now, that we cannot afford to fixate on infrastructure bills alone. For if you build it, they will come only happens when a person can afford the service. Instead, we must have a mix of broadband access with that infrastructure bill, digital literacy and affordability programs, and even these essential efforts will only net success if they are homegrown and needs-driven. Currently, the FCC defines broadband as 25 megabits per second download and 3 megabits per second upload. But by the agency's estimates, which a GAO report recently criticized as inaccurate and underreported, well, and I mean well, in excess of 30 million Americans are without access to these speeds. That is why I say that universal service, the fund, cannot and should not be morphed into becoming an infrastructure-only fund. Carefully crafted lifeline reforms must not be abandoned, and the program must remain one that addresses the affordability crisis. The red tape in the E-rate application approval process must be cut, and the program must remain a hybrid, focusing on affordability and infrastructure for those living and having no access at home to have access when they go to schools and to the library, because if they did not have this subsidy, they would have no connection. So it is time for us to really sit down and have a serious, nonpartisan, not bipartisan, nonpartisan discussion on what it will take once and for all to close these persistent digital divides. And we must, I think, have a serious discussion of about how to recalibrate and administer a universal service fund with fewer, if any, silos. And it is high time for the needs and objectives of those in our communities to take center stage. In the area of intelligent transportation, as an example, if cities were to deploy spectrum and assets to support these systems, they could, at the very same time, supply communities that are faced with high rates of diabetes and obesity, and low rates of access to broadband with a cost-effective transportation infrastructure, which will enable patients to get back and forth to medical facilities for the critical care they need. Now, I know there's a debate on what the definition of a smart city is. To me, that is the foundation for a smart city. But while the high cost, also known as the Connect America Fund, is admittedly closing some digital gaps in rural communities, too many urban communities lack access, which is why the FCC should create more incentives, not less, for companies to deploy service over fixed and mobile wireless networks to undercapitalized communities. By making wireless spectrum available through auctions, it can cost tens of millions of dollars to acquire one license in an area the size of Cincinnati, Denver, or New York City. But the FCC does not require companies to serve 100% of those license areas. This ultimately results in what I refer to as a donut hole, a not so delicious donut hole. Areas where licensed wireless companies can choose not to serve, and there are voids where too many residents who live below the poverty line reside. But the FCC has an opportunity to allocate spectrum in the 3.5 gigahertz band that could encourage companies to deploy fixed wireless and mobile networks to serve those donut holes. In 2015, as you know, the FCC designed licenses that are smaller in geographic size and should be less expensive than traditional wireless licenses. These priority access licenses, or PALs, are designed to serve an area that is the size of a census tract. Smaller sizes of those PALs, as I said, like the size of a census tract, can improve the possibility that companies of any size can provide wireless service to communities of need, both rural, urban, and in between. The FCC is yet to do this, but the concept has attracted a lot of interest from non-traditional companies, which is exactly what Section 309J of the Communications Act intended for spectrum auctions. The current proposal, which increases the size of PALs, will make it more difficult to achieve that result. So I encourage you to weigh in if you believe that communities, large and small, deserve more opportunities when it comes to connectivity. Now, I said encourage. I still cannot lobby you, so I'm using the word encourage. Let the record reflect that I used the word encourage. Deployment, as I said, is just one part of the broadband equation. And filling that donut hole with wireless service or connecting a house to fiber does not automatically mean that service is available. What if the monthly cost is too high? What if residents do not own a computer or a mobile device? There are 5 million people today, as we eat lunch, that do not have any type of telecommunications device. What if they do not see the relevance of broadband in their lives? Well, the FCC's Lifeline program is an attempt to address and close that affordability gap. E-rate seeks to close the gap, and those schools and libraries that offer digital literacy programs at times when the community can access them are narrowing the gap. But strangling the Lifeline program, the nation's only means-tested universal service program that addresses the cost of voice and broadband service, and allowing only facilities-based providers to offer Lifeline service as is currently proposed, will leave an estimated 70% of subscribers who cannot afford communication service today without a viable option tomorrow. And in the midst of those existing challenges lurks another consequential transition, the transition of our current wireless communications networks to the next generation of standards, or 5G. The promise here is greater speeds, which could allow the transfer of more information and data, less latency which could bring about fewer delays when it comes to the transfer of that data. That's especially interesting and hopeful for us if you're interested in telehealth and telemedicine. And the ability to connect to more devices, which should yield greater network efficiencies. Now, I know there are many 5G skeptics in the room. You know who you are because I spoke to some of you yesterday. But if realized, the next generation standard could offer a prime opportunity to apply the lessons we have learned from previous transitions to these upcoming and hopefully better standards. We could get things right from the beginning of the rollout. And while 5G may be absolutely critical when it comes to innovative new technologies and networks, such as the Internet of Things and smarter cities, as well as technology that will help unleash the next wave of smart grid features and efficiencies, leaving behind those outside of those urban areas that are sure to benefit, and those areas that are low net worth would be tragic and costly for us all. By allowing many unconnected, energy-consuming devices to be integrated into the electric grid through low-cost connections, for example, 5G promises to enable devices to be more accurately monitored in order to support better forecasting of our energy needs, which could revolutionize energy grids and create innovation in energy delivery, choice, and efficiency. But these benefits, including any potential cost savings, must be ubiquitous, and that ubiquity, my friends, must be non-negotiable. So as we auction spectrum, facilitate infrastructure bills, reform universal service, and you know I was going to mention it, debate net neutrality. Why not seize the opportunity to leapfrog the status quo when it comes to competition and deployment? I have said this many, many times, and I get no comfort in affirming this. Too many in our communities are still waiting for a 3G or 4G future. So as I shift to my chair and give us an opportunity to engage in conversation over dessert, which I promise not to eat, here's another painful fact that you know that we need to ponder. Nearly half of the communities in this country have one or fewer high-speed broadband providers, which means the lack of competition remains a barrier for too many. But what if the commission were to adopt or auction our 5G spectrum in a way that promotes more robust competition and incentivizes new competitors and markets all across this nation? What kind of future could that mean for each of us, where opportunities abound, where we live, work, and play? I say a bright future, if and only if we make the right connection. Thank you.
I'm going to ask a couple of questions. I'm going to ask you while we're engaging in this Q&A. Please prepare some questions you have for Mignon. So I want to thank you for all that you have done for those who tend not to have a voice. And in particular, one area of your focus has been in support of families of the incarcerated.
Right.
And I think we can all agree it's helpful for families and their incarcerated family members to be able to remain in communication. But there's been a lot of controversy regarding the cost of these calls. Can you help us understand the origin of the problem and why it has proven so difficult to solve?
For those of you who have no idea what we're talking about, you're among the lucky ones. There are 2+ million persons right now that are incarcerated. There are 2.7 million children who are, those are their parents. But there is a system that has morphed into incredibly high costs when it comes to telephone service, when it comes to service in terms of inmate, calling, the inmate calling regime. Now, it depends on who you talk to as to how this came about. If you were to talk to the Andy Schwartzmans of the world, he would say, honestly, the 1996 Telecommunications Act brought this about because we were encouraging competition and less regulating and allowing market forces to take hold. And the market force, that's fine when it's a competitive ecosystem. But this is one area where there's no competition after the award for that contract is granted. And that would be fine if there were the traditional model of an awarding of contract when it comes to these services. But what is too often happening is, unlike most government contracts, the lowest cost or the lowest bidder does not get the contract. The one who bids the highest, who offers the, this shared economic rewards with the facility. Some people call it commissions. Others call it kickbacks. I'll leave it to you as to how you label it. But what it means is it is not uncommon for someone trying to keep in touch with a loved one who's incarcerated, or an attorney trying to represent someone who may be rightly or wrongly incarcerated, to spend in excess of $1 a minute for service, where we all know it costs nowhere near that, even with profit motives and incentives built in to provide a service. So it's in an unjust and unreasonable infrastructure, and regardless of how tough you are on crime, I don't think any of us would be endorsers of being tough on 2.7 million children who did not make a mistake, but their families are paying deeply for that. And that ripple effects means that all of the infrastructure that you're building, those families can't afford it. They can't afford connectivity because they're paying $300 and $400 a month to keep in touch. So, for me, you can tell it's an emotional issue, but to me, it does not make business sense. It does not make business sense for anybody in this room to ignore this, because again, we're talking about millions of families who will never be able to connect to your networks, who will never, be able to fully participate, in this, economy. And every credible study shows that keeping in touch during your sentence enables better transitions at home. And if you do the math and do the studies, within 5 years, 75% of those incarcerated are right back in the system, which means you and me, we pay on average of $35,000 a year, for a cot to keep them housed. And if there were a way for us to break that cycle, and I think affordable rates would be one way, then we would all economically benefit. Again, may not be high on your radar screen, but you should take notice.
Thank you, thank you. Now, you talked a bit about small cells and 5G. And the FCC is today, or may already have voted today, on a small cells order it actually is deepening the mistrust that exists between industry and communities. I talk to people who represent industry, I talk to people who represent cities, towns, and counties, and many of them feel like this will actually slow deployment of small cells. So what are your thoughts on this order, and what can city and industry do to build a stronger relationship that'll actually move us closer to the goal we all share, which is providing ubiquitous, fabulous service to our residents?
So let me set the stage and the baseline here. I am pro streamlining. I am pro eliminating regulatory impediments. I am pro eliminating unnecessary delays that some, not most, jurisdictions have put up. So let us be clear. There are some problems. I am anti using a sledgehammer when a scalpel will do. And this is why I voted against the initial order and further notice, because I did not think that it took into account the needs and the challenges state and local communities have. I did not think that it allowed for enough engagement with lower income Native and other communities. I just thought that the shot clock that is being codified was, I'm trying to be politically correct, was short-sighted. Now, this is a person who approved the bulk of the Spectrum Frontiers, order back in 2014. But if you take a look at what I attempted to convey during that, I was pro allowing industry to help those resource-constrained communities with the expedited review of what seems to be at the heart of, and I'm just going to say it out loud, the preemption model that is being codified. I don't think it will get us there any quicker, and it will definitely be harmful when it comes to what needs to be a cooperative environment. So if I were still on payroll, I am very confident that my vote would have been the same, because I don't see where this really addresses the issues. I don't see where there is a highlighting of those best practices and having a way to make that more ubiquitous. What I do see is some entities with a firm cost not being able to cover their cost, because not all communities are created equal. And what I do see, and forgive me, because I'm going to offend about 10 people in the room, sounding a little political, what I do see is some hypocrisy here. The FCC has constantly refused to really, especially in the last 18 months, to do anything about a broken regime of inmate calling that we just talked about. But it is gung-ho about putting in or being almost a rate regulator here when it comes to the fees and inciting and all of these other issues. Micromanaging. Let me just be plain spoken, because that's who I am. So this is troublesome. I think again it perpetuates unneeded tensions, and in the long run we're going to spend more money in court than we will, getting some of the smaller communities connected. And I think it was wrong-headed.
Thank you. So, do we have any questions? Because I have more, but I thought I'd check first.
Now, there are 3 people in this room who I threatened. Apparently, y'all didn't take me seriously. But that's all right. I know who you are. The gentleman from Dublin.
Okay, we do have a question.
I didn't threaten him, though.
It was a credible threat. A couple of presentations here have talked about outcomes and being prepared to measure outcomes, and you spoke about this donut hole. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if, and if you build it, they will not necessarily come. We have communities where a provider exists that claims to offer service.
Right.
But that does not mean that the people in that area have access to that service, can afford that service, or when you talk about health activities and making it to appointments. Mm-hmm. Those are measurable activities,
right,
with outcomes-based things. And I wonder, as we attempt to have a nonpartisan conversation about the value of our decisions, whether being more outcomes-based, how could we possibly be more outcomes-based and say, well, why don't we just look at some health outcomes or some appointments or some mobility to appointments that was achieved through broadband tools to tell us whether or not a decision was the best or not?
Well, what is clear is after 30 some odd years of universal service regime, which has done incredible things, please don't get me wrong, it has done some incredible things for communities in need, that the numbers honestly are more frightening. That GAO report that I mentioned, honestly, if you didn't read it, it's in keeping with what the spirit of what I sense that you are driving at, is that we spent billions of dollars And I'm not sure how truly, if we were a business enterprise, what our compensation, what the CEO compensation would be, honestly. And so that means for me that it needs to be a sort of ground up, bubble up, as opposed to being federal, handed down from the government. There are too many silos. There is not enough, community interaction and focus on what, those pillars that some were enumerated in a national broadband plan years ago, those chapters that looked at health, community engagement, education, and all of the chapter silos that it enumerated are critical needs and desires of communities. Those are, no matter where you go, people want access for, connectivity for higher education, telehealth, being able, they know they can't make their meetings. What do we do to address those issues? Because to me, that justifies, makes the business case, and makes the opportunity to better leverage those universal service dollars, which are limited, with other types of partnerships that can make that money go further and really close divides. We're not doing that. We're not having those conversations. We're not challenging the system we have in place. Just double downs on overbills. It encourages that. It makes it the American way to plagiarize Jonathan Chambers, but I guess it's not plagiarism if you give him credit. But these are things that we need to really talk about. Is what we're doing truly addressing the needs of the communities? I say it's not effective. I cannot give us an A, B. We barely get a C, depending on where where you live. And these are the conversations, a gentleman from Dublin, whose name I've forgotten, that we have to have, because again, we will have the same conversation in 2025 wherever you have Great Lakes, and the numbers will not be appreciably lower if we don't flip the script, so to speak, and have these conversations looking at the needs from the ground.
And it's Doug.
Doug, thank you, Doug from Dublin, double D.
Any other questions? We have one right here.
Hi, always a pleasure to see you.
It's good to see you too.
Since your departure, the FCC's released their updated mapping. And it doesn't seem to depict nearly the statistics that you and I know so well.
Right.
You mentioned up here. And kind of, as Doug was saying, we can't manage what we can't measure. And so many critical decisions are being based on that very same information that is knowingly flawed. Is there any solution to the mapping so that we can make sure not to overbuild and direct targeted investment where it's actually needed, and measure, more importantly, measure the results of programs like CAP2 and the Mobility Fund and some of the others?
So now you're talking about a $50 million investment. That's what it's cost so far, right? About $50 million to look at and to affirm something that, to put forth a map that has no auditing mechanism. The one thing you can do is force the companies that submit the information for Form 477, to be audited. Look, all of you are very honest, but we need to verify. So if you don't have the verification, and if you say that my house is served, that means the entire census block is served, and you go with that model, then the majority of that community is not served. So we need to have a different type of threshold. One is not serving, is not considered served. Is it 75% or whatever? It has to be way north of a single, a facility, and to not look at truly the affordability side of the equation and not make that a part of the evaluation matrix is wrong-headed. I'm borrowing Michael Steele's, just show that I'm bipartisan. I'm borrowing Michael Steele. That's not the word that I want, the phrase that I want to use. It is really not good policy or practice, honestly. So, those would be to me, the foundation of having a more accurate depiction or map that will be truly useful. Today's map only benefits those unaudited. So apparently, I don't care about job security, but it only benefits. You know who it benefits. Just in case I need to transition to another. Not that I care about that more than you, but I do like eating.
So much of the Form...
Okay, I'm sorry, where are you?
I'm sorry, right here.
Thank you.
Much of the Form 477, by the time the maps come out, they're a year and
Dated.
a half old. They're information we submitted a year and a half ago.
Right.
What can we do to speed the FCC up on that? And then the other part of that question is the way the FCC considers served. It includes both voice and internet, and many, many new entrants, particularly small companies, really have no interest in offering a traditional voice service.
Mm-hmm.
They end up not counted or just disappear entirely off the map. What can we do about that?
So there has got to be a more real-time submission or mechanism to upload, that information. And so, there's got to be a technology-driven solution so that we would not have that, that lag. The second one, company, you mentioned the companies that might not want to have a full menu, offer a full menu of service, and I want to make sure that I'm addressing your question in a proper manner. So, one of the things that we can do is to be more innovative and inclusive with the types of companies that could offer service and make up the ecosystem. As it stands now, even though the FCC professes to be technology neutral, it absolutely, honestly, is not by way of some of its policy making. So I'm not sure if I'm driving at where you're headed on that second question. The first one is going to have to be technology driven and information uploaded and updated in real time.
So for programs like CAF and CAF2 and reverse auction,
Okay.
an area is considered unserved if the provider is not offering both voice and internet. And that tends to get reflected in the maps of what areas are unserved.
Right. And so maybe more granularity, more granularity in the reporting that shows you exactly what, I'm sorry?
Yeah, breaking those.
Right. And so.
Not discounted if you're just offering internet services. A lot of new entrants do.
Absolutely. There have been some criticism, particularly with what is being codified today about, how to count satellite, in other, and so again, we need a real world, more granular, more useful, picture, and there is a way to do that, to be more, to have more categories will allow a real picture of what's being offered by whom, at what speed, the latency. It needs to be more granular.
I've heard a lot of people asking about the data having an impact so in communities where there is no competition,
Mm-hmm.
people are caught, the cost pushes them out of the market. That information also isn't included in the Form
Absolutely.
477, and that it would be very helpful to understand the reasons that people are not adopting broadband if we knew the cost.
To me, in order for that to be effective, in order for us to really, which you probably know, I promise I didn't vote against everything at the FCC, but in terms of the 2018, broadband report, I took issues with that because it didn't look at that, didn't look, I think, at that. It used a different type of standard comparing what the last report was to this report and deeming success based on improvements there as opposed to looking, at the total actual picture. We don't have enough granularity. There's not, in terms of the matrix, it's not as as inclusive as it should be. And if you're not talking about every single barrier to broadband connectivity, to include, population density, types of services and companies that offer those types of services offered, and the affordability factor, then we're never going to truly move the needle, because you've got to figure out, what all of the issues are, and the companies that are best suited, to address those issues. And again, innovation, we will not have innovation in disruptive, which would be the only way to truly close these gaps, if of companies, including those who want to take an innovative approach to closing the digital and opportunities divide, if they don't know, what the landscape looks like, or if they feel they have an agency that only the big players can play in this space, you're not going to address the needs of, when I hung out in Marietta, Ohio, their needs are not being met. The needs are not being met. And to say that only one, and I don't have a problem with satellite, to say that satellite is the only solution, or check the box, if that's a provider, and say, that everything is covered. If satellite, when I went down to Raymond, Mississippi, they were like, oh, we've got satellite. It costs 3 times as much as twice as much as my my mobile service, and I get half of the reliability. Again, not being negative about a technology or a company. This is reality, and this is what I'm hearing on the ground. So we really need to make that mechanism one in which it gives us the information we need, paints a true picture. That's the only way we're going to get out of this, out of the state we're in.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a question.
Oh, you okay.
Tribal areas in particular struggle with subpar service, and there are a lot of challenges in supporting fast, affordable, reliable access within those communities. But I'm hoping you can give us some ideas of what communities can and should be doing in an effort to spur progress.
Again, I have always pushed for a dedicated, a tribal, affordability or connectivity fund. I have always, pushed for, even in the more omnibus, RAF and CAF and, all of the acronyms, rural, those funds, push for the inclusion and recognition of those communities. But first we've got an Office of Native Affairs that is one of the most underutilized divisions inside of the agency. The reason why there's a stay now, when it comes to that Lifeline program, is because it was acknowledged that the needs and the alternatives they said the FCC did not take into account what would happen if they took away the link-up part of the Lifeline program. And so, again, the numbers are clear. Native nations, by and large, are 1.5 to 2 generations behind their urban counterparts. When you see, when it comes to fixed services, that you see that the percentages are 66% of those lands, Native nations, without the proper type of fixed or true fixed broadband service, versus 2% in urban areas. That means that we're not doing it right and leveraging the type of relationships and being creative enough. And I think getting rid of a lot of these silos that I mentioned. I understand why we have a high-cost fund, a Healthcare Connect fund, E-Rate, and Lifeline. I understand that. But 3 of those are 2 are intensely, infrastructure-oriented. One is a hybrid, and the other one, as you know, I don't believe should be. But all of those encourage and enable infrastructure build. If there are common, especially anchor-oriented platforms where money is coming from one of those silos, and you can't intermingle and use it with the other, even though the foundation is there, that means we're going to overbuild and be less efficient, and the monies will not go as far. And so that's why, to me, we need a regulatory recalibration across the board about, how we can truly look at the infrastructure, the foundation being agnostic, and the benefits and rewards and the services that rely on them to be, the drivers. And that might be more work and fewer divisions with the FCC, but that will bring about more ubiquity, at a faster rate. And those conversations aren't being had. So, the things that you're talking about here about common platforms and the like, that conversation can't end here or can't be, insular within, your infrastructure. That needs to go outside, and that needs to be a part of the regulatory governmental conversation too, because we need to reinvent ourselves. I keep saying we, past me. That has to be, a part of the conversation. If not, again, in 10, 15 years, we're gonna have the same conversations about the same communities and the same divides. And I don't know about you, but I get really sick and tired of the same conversations year after year. So how do we encourage, for a new paradigm and new levels of successes to be defined? That's a reinventing and a rehealing of yourself, including the FCC. There was a gentleman in gingham or whatever, something I wear occasionally, but I don't say it too loudly.
We've got microphone over here. So in Wichita, the population is just shy of 500,000.
I'm sorry.
In Wichita, Kansas, we've got a population just shy of 500,000 people. We've got the Pew survey came out in March regarding broadband access to communities. About 11% of urbanites don't have access to mobile or broadband internet. In Wichita, we had a private commission study. We found out it was actually 25% of our community, 125,000 people give or take. As that digital divide we spoke of, as these services move more and more online and they are no longer being offered, it's not just from a city's perspective, it's from also the providers within cities are no longer offering the same services.
Right.
Do you have any advice for how we can help bridge that gap where we get more of those percentage of people? Because it's not always they don't access the internet. Sometimes it's affordability, and sometimes it's just simply they don't want to be online.
Well, the last part, you're always going to have those who voluntarily disconnect or disengage. And I've got no problems because there are times when, that's not true. I'm always on. Okay, so I don't understand it. No, let me be clear. I don't understand it, but I respect it. But that's not the bulk of the people, that's not the bulk of people's experiences. Most people want to be able to affordably connect to help bridge gaps for their children, for the seniors, for those with disabilities and the like. We have got to really look at our universal service construct, not just a universal service form, our universal service constructs, both at the state levels and at the federal levels, and making sure that it is not prohibiting innovative, creative, companies, the enterprising companies that want to tackle some of the issues and want to do it differently and affordably, and want to have, different, and I get in trouble with this with the net neutrality which I am pro net neutrality, tiers of offerings, because I really love Tesla cars. Well, I'll talk to you about the CEO offline, but I really love Tesla cars, but I can't afford it. And so, but I have to drive. So I'm driving a Beetle, and that's fine. And if that's my entryway to connectivity, then we should not be doing, the government should not get in the way if the needs of those at different levels of, economic wherewithal. And so we need to make sure that we're not in the way at the state level in terms of, should only eligible telecommunications carriers, should they be the only ones playing in the space? These are questions that we need, to ask. And if the needs aren't being met, then maybe we need to either try experiments or open the doors up while protecting the public. We need to not be so fixated because we did it for 30 and 40 years. That is what is needed in order to close that. What was said was 11%. What you said is actually 25%.
In our city, it's 25%.
Yes, gap in your communities. We've got to recalibrate, and we've got to allow more innovation and opportunities. That's not happening. The current construct is not allowing enough innovation and competition and alternative enterprises to thrive. That's the key.
Do we have another question?
Yes, sir. Oh, I thought you were raising your hand. Is that how you think? Like this? This is how you think? Okay. All right, you got one more bite of that one. I guess we
Why
can.
do you think there is less innovation? Is it influence of special interests, or is it public protection or competition? Why don't they free up more programs for likely providers instead of focusing on the old guard?
Well, so when you talk about the old guard who's been around for a long time, who have built relationships, and I don't knock relationships. I love relationships, most relationships. You can't discount that. And so, being the incumbent has advantages. And I co-signed early on to some of our, first phases of, the Connect America Fund, kind of giving more of an incentive to who can build out quicker. But I think we're not at a different phase. I really don't think, going back to what I said earlier, that there is enough local and statewide, there are enough charrettes or conversations I had about exactly what's missing, exactly what's needed, and how we can best get there, and how policies at the state commissions and at the federal commission can be changed. That conversation is not being had, because if you leave it to, if we continue on this path, there will be limited, I think, innovation in a less traditional space. We will get there. We'll get there. But how many students without broadband will we have undereducated, in the meantime? And that's what we need to ask. Are we going to leverage technology, innovation? Are we going to be as fixated on level of playing field as some of the providers are with 5G, having 5G deployment? And until that enthusiasm and that focus is more ubiquitous and where there might be 5 million people with no G, until you have that happening there, then you're not going to see appreciable change. Again, power is as power does, the only way for that to change is the inputs have to change, and the people have to be more vocal, and industry has to be more engaged with these pillars. Government, communities, as I say, industry, all of this engagement, and more. We have to have a conversations about what we want, what we need, and how best to get there, and be willing to make some hard, difficult decisions. Non-traditional decisions, to get there. We're going to lose whatever race we think we're participating in. It's not just about China and South Korea. We need to look. I get it. That we can't be fixated on what technology evolution, what communications evolution. It's about what's going on in Marietta, in Detroit. More succinctly, it's what's not going on there, is what we need to talk about. Oh, now you have a question.
This question is segues somewhat to it. Isn't it like sort of about democratization of the whole access in some ways to make it more so that everybody has access? I mean, there's the 2014 study by Billings and whatever the Princeton study that shows that basically what the people would like or need is not being addressed in any issues, and it's only higher up the ladder you get, so that it's the money in politics that is, in essence, driving the inability of this democratization.
So I don't disagree with that, but I think those who are dissatisfied with that, and I've said this a lot, and I'll close with this. There's a business case to be made for a disruptive paradigm, and those of us who care about it, we have to do a better job at making it. There are models. I know some of you are I don't know if it's a secret, you shouldn't have told me. I know some of you, are heading to Europe to look at some, of some other, models using common platforms, so you don't have to, overbuild. We need to have all of those at the table. But we need to do a better job of aligning ourselves with academics or whoever else could put it in written form, coming from the, people who might not write it down, to justify and make the case for this. We're not doing a great job at that. Now, that's just, and I'm being self-critical here. And so if you can't show where money is to be made, where improvements are to be had, then we're going to have, again, the same conversation next year, year after next. But it can be made. And it has to be made, and it's urgent that it be made. So if you care about it, align yourselves to the people who can put it in a form in which regulators and this is the other silo that I knew that I had forgotten. Lawmakers. We got to put it in a form in which, as a PK, a politician's kid, you have to put it in the form in which, that's my PK experience, in which politicians speak. If you can show them the benefit where it could give them the talking points, help get them elected, improve their, their districts, then we'll move. The missing element that I forgot to mention is the political side of the equation. You can't ignore that.
So I think that's going to be the last word. And so I would like to ask you all to join me in thanking Mignon.
Thank you for the opportunity.